Shaftesbury, the park there, the park, Blossomberry and Sunderland. We go around this way.
Hi, Heather Supina. I represent Windsor 4, the towns of Barnard, Bridgewater, and West Hartford.
Hi, John O'Brien, and I represent Windsor Orange 1, which is Royalton in my hometown, Tunbridge.
Richard Nelson, I represent Orleans 1, which is the town of Derby.
Jed Lipsky, Lamoille 1, Stowe.
Leland Morgan, I represent Grand Isle County and West Milton.
Sidonia is our committee assistant, and Sidonia, do we have any committee members doing? Michelle, if you are able to unmute and want to introduce yourself, please go ahead.
Left the building.
Okay, right.
Maybe she pressed the wrong button.
Oh, when she comes back. And then Representative Burt may also be joining. With that, I'm going to turn it over to these two representatives of the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation here to talk about, we title it Climate Resilience. So I haven't previewed the presentation and I'm very interested in hearing what you've got to say. We know that building resilience has become more and more part of a larger conversation about climate, not just mitigating anymore, but actually how do we in the short term try and deal with the consequences, the immediate consequences. So with that, I'll turn it over and hear what you have to say.
So I guess I've been told, for the record, my name is Al Freeman. I'm the climate forester for Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation. And so, as you said, I will be talking about forest and climate resilience today. And so this presentation is really a brief overview of kind of how we think about forest and climate resilience. And then I'm going to provide a few case studies of how we're actively doing that within FPR. And so there are many complex problems facing Vermont's forests, and I think it's important to understand the past to better understand where we are now. So during the 1800s and 1900s, there was wide-scale clearing of our forests. About 80% of our forests were lost due to land use practices, including agriculture, the ensuing sheep craze, the timber boom. And so that resulted in, a severe decline of our forests. So today we have nearly about 80% of that landscape is back to a forested state, which is a really remarkable thing to think about. But in the scale of time, that means our forests are still kind of in a relatively young stage. A lot of these forests have grown in a similar time frame, and so they have kind of these simple structures and simple characteristics. And so these relatively simple landscapes are now being faced with many challenges, and sometimes all at once. And so across the region, we're seeing more extreme weather. We'll kind of touch on this a little bit later in the presentation. We're also seeing more deer browse on species and forest regeneration, and especially in the South, which can have huge implications for our future forests. And then we are seeing more introduced pests and pathogens. So EAB, emerald ash borer, is moving across the state. We have beech leaf disease that is knocking on our door, which has huge implications for what our forest composition will look like. And then lastly, we're seeing habitat shifts. So climate regimes are changing at a much faster rate than natural tree migration has historically shown to keep pace with. And so this can generate these significant lags in trees' natural migration to kind of keep up with climate. And so again, this is going to have implications for our forest composition in the future. So with these challenges in mind, it's really important to understand how our forests are going to respond. So when we consider forests that are maybe more simple in structure, they're going to have similar age, similar species composition, compared to a more complex forest, which has that kind of diversity of species, diversity of ages. And the reason this is important is in this figure, if we think of this dot here kind of as either an extreme climate event or a pest outbreak in that forest, a forest that has that simple structure has less options to be able to respond to that stress. So it has less recovery pathways. Whereas if we have a more complex forest, they have more avenues to be able to respond to these stressors. And so this is the core of what we think of resilience as. So to put a definition to it, forest resilient is the ability to withstand and recover from disturbances such as climate change, pests, and pathogens. So now I want to walk through kind of what are the characteristics that contribute towards resilience and how can we better understand what resilience is. So I really want to show you why the figure on the left is less resilient than the figure on the right. So first,
Al, excuse me, if it's all right, to interrupt with questions?
yeah, definitely.
I just wondered if you could sort of define complex versus simple forest too. Like,
Yeah.
even how Vermont breaks out now.
Definitely. So what I'm about to get into with my slides will kind of break up those characteristics. But, you know, a simple forest is again, one that's going to have very similar age classes, similar species. You know, if you're walking out in the woods, you're not going to see a diversity of, you know, you'll have an overstory, a midstory, and an understory. It'll be one or the other. You know, you're lacking kind of that structural complexity. So the following slides will kind of break that down in a little bit greater detail, but that's a great question and a great segue. So whenever we're talking about diversity of species, the reason we want this is because not all species are susceptible to the same challenges. So some species can withstand drought better than others, while others can handle more extreme precipitation and, you know, be in wet conditions longer. Another important element along with diversity is we want redundancy. And so what I mean by that is that we want species that have similar roles. So a great example of this is, you know, again, beech leaf disease and beech bark disease are a really big threat to our beech populations, which are important for wildlife. They produce beech nuts that wildlife rely on. So by having other masting species like red oak on those sites, that can kind of help fill that role if we lose beech on the landscape. So again, thinking of diversity, but also redundancy of these characteristics. We also want various sizes and ages of trees. And so some stressors are disproportionate effects on trees of particular sizes or ages. You know, windstorms, if you have a really huge windstorm, old, mature trees with big canopies are more likely to be impacted by a windstorm than smaller trees. And then certain insects target or are more lethal to different ages of trees or trees of certain sizes. Another example would be, you know, white pine weevil and spruce budworm are really dependent on tree size. And so that again is why you want that kind of diversity of ages within your forest. We also want structural complexity. So a range of spatial conditions is really important because it creates these unique microsites. It creates different resource conditions and provides, again, those multiple pathways of recovery. So this image that you see here is from the Second College Grant owned by Dartmouth. It's 27,000 acres where they've implemented this project called the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change. And you can see these smaller gaps. There's a 1 acre gap here. There is a 1/4 acre gap. And then you see a lot of mature intact forest across the landscape. And then there's some thinning that's done in between that. And so this provides habitat in those gaps for more sun-loving or shade-intolerant species that may have more drought-tolerant characteristics. And you can kind of see on those gaps, you'll see shade there. And so that can be really great for regenerating mid-tolerant species or shade-tolerant species that can then be that next generation in that forest. It's also great lunch habitat for moose and deer, which is really important. And then those thinnings, treatments that happen there, allows for an influx of resources to those trees that have been released from that kind of competition, and that can increase their sequestration. So having the structural complexity can really contribute to a bunch of different aspects that are important. We also want an appropriate amount of deadwood present. As mentioned, our land use history has resulted in a lot of forests that are still relatively young in the context of a forest age. And so one component that's really lacking is deadwood on the ground. And the reason it's important is because it contributes to nutrient cycling. Species like red spruce and yellow birch really use those as nurse logs that help them, again, regenerate and move into that canopy. And it can help slow spread and sink water. We also want ample tree regeneration, including future adaptive species. And so making sure your forest has regeneration going on is important in case we have a disturbance event. You have your next generation ready to go. This is also an opportunity where we may plant future adaptive species. And so this could look like if you have a species that is expected to do well in the future, but it's in low abundance on that site, you could plant more of that species, but source seed from more southern sources so that it has kind of those different traits that can be brought to that location. And last, we want to help promote biodiversity by protecting rare species, natural communities, and unique landscape features. And so with all of this in mind, my hope is that this will kind of give you a more critical lens next time you're walking through your woods, where you can kind of assess what is the resilience of this forest? Am I seeing these features that are important whenever we're talking about resilience on our landscape? And so now that we've touched on how we may add these characteristics, I'm going to look at why this is necessary because of climate change impacts. So climate change is leading to greater variability, including precipitation. And as all of us are acutely aware, the most important changes in precipitation are not the annual averages that we get, which has increased by 7 inches since 1895, but it's in the timing, frequency, and severity of these events. And so precipitation is not uniform across sites. It's really dependent on topography, the landscape position, the upslope watershed, the slope, the soil type, how well do those soils drain. All of those have huge implications for how precipitation will affect our forests. We're also seeing more frequent and severe droughts. And the reason this is really important is seedling germination is very dependent on precipitation and drought. And so this can have implications on how our forests are going to generate into the future. We're also seeing 2-degree warming in the summer and 4-degree warming in the winter on average. And really, I want to focus on that winter piece because this translates to less snow. And with less snow, we have more freeze-thaw cycles. It's also really insulating for fine roots. And so when there's less insulative snow, we're seeing deeper freezes that can kill those root systems. And Hubbard Brook actually did this really great study where they removed snow just to kind of see how those roots were affected and how growth was affected. And they did find in treatments that received, less snow, they had severe damage to the root systems. And then that following growing season, those trees had significantly reduced growth rates. So again, these conditions can create these kind of long-term cascading effects that can result from these milder winters. Warmer winters also benefit pests. So hemlock woolly adelgid is really dependent on these lethal winter temperatures. So if we don't have enough cold weather, those populations are going to kind of, keep expanding. There's nothing really knocking them back. And so as you can see from the last 5 years, this figure is, I need to update it. It was from 2023, but you can see that the mortality has decreased. So we're seeing more hemlock woolly adelgid populations. And then there's also the potential for those to expand northward as temperatures warm. So climate change, lastly, is leading to greater vulnerability. So we've kind of looked 2 sides of what make up vulnerability. We've looked at forest resilience and forest threats, which both, again, determine how vulnerable that site is. So forest threats are considered in the potential impacts of vulnerability. So this is how sensitive is that forest to changes like temperature, precipitation, and other threats. So if we were to think about 2 different forests, an alpine spruce forest or an oak forest, they're both experiencing 3-degree warming, the spruce forest is going to be more sensitive to that warming than an oak forest. So it's really important to think of how that sensitivity may show up in that forest. And then adaptive capacity is really that resilience of the forest. What are those resilient characteristics we have, but as well as the ability to adapt to those changes. So we touched on, high diversity is really important in terms of adaptive capacity, but also having high dispersal ability, being able to spread and move, as well as having few dispersal barriers. So if we were to think of a forest in Burlington, maybe Centennial Woods, that forest is pretty isolated, so it is likely to have less adaptive capacity. Whereas if we're thinking of a well-connected forest, there's more adaptive capacity, more ability to have different sources and movement within that. So we often utilize this framework of vulnerability to determine how to best manage our forests. And so this leads me into forest management. So what does it look like? Forest management is made with thoughtful choices. It involves sometimes stepping in, sometimes stepping back. And it's really to ensure that our forests stay healthy, resilient, and meet the needs of future generations. And so this may lead to actions that could include controlling invasives, building bridges, building trails, and it includes, cutting trees where we want to add some of those resilient characteristics. And it could also mean taking a passive approach in areas that have low vulnerability and may need protecting. And so really in practice, it often means both doing active practices and passive practices. And it's about kind of balancing all of these objectives you see here. So thinking of things about climate resilience, how do we address biodiversity, carbon storage and sequestration, recreation, and also producing forest products for a robust economy. And so all of these objectives aren't treated as, these isolated things. We want to optimize multiple objectives, not maximize one over the other. So it's kind of this yes and, like, yes, we can address this and these other goals. And so for the remaining time of my presentation, I'm hoping to highlight a few projects where we are actively doing all of these objectives. So a great example of this is a project that is in partnership with Audubon Vermont. This is at Mount Mansfield State Forest, and it's focused around Audubon silviculture with birds in mind. And so this guidance is really directing how can we manage for specific bird species. And so a lot of the treatments that have been applied there are these small gaps along with thinnings. And so not only are we enhancing habitat for biodiversity with these treatments, but as we kind of touched on with those small gaps, we're allowing for enhancing species that we want to have on the site. So oftentimes those gaps are going to be centered around having those tree species on the edge that can then facilitate their seed and or be centered around advanced regeneration that's already there so that we have a new generation of forests. So again, these kind of treatments are contributing to all of those different things we touched on in terms of those characteristics for resilience. And then the other really exciting part of this is the trees that are harvested from these treatments are actually going to the Lamel Mill in Essex. So it's producing hyper-local wood products that people use and is a really important piece of the puzzle to be able for landowners to be able to do these types of work. The Lux project that I will highlight is we are working to establish research-grade climate adaptation management projects. This is in partnership with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and the University of Vermont to kind of consider climate change risk and adaptation. So what this will look like is we're planning to create these replicated treatments based around the objectives we're trying to achieve, along with control plots. And so this is going to be measured every 1, 3, 5, 10, 20, 30 years. It's a long-term project that's really aimed at trying to address climate resilience and also to have it be a place where people can learn about how they can manage their own forests. And so the last slide is, to talk about a changing climate puts our forests and all the services they provide at risk. And I don't want to end on a sad note. And so to counter that, we are working with partners and across programs to try to address these risks. And we currently have a landscape scale or LSR grant, which supports both climate adaptation and local forest economies. And this connection is really important because to be able to support some of those practices that I was talking about on adding diversity and this complexity to forests, we have to be able to pay for them. And in order to do that, having a robust forest economy is really essential, especially for landowners who sometimes can't afford to do the practices needed to restore a degraded forest. And so we're currently pursuing more money to further this effort. And really this goal is to also help inform landowners on how they can make these decisions and face these same challenges. With that, I will hand it off to Catherine. And here's some resources if you want to take a little quick screenshot. These are all really great sources for learning more about climate resilience and how you can manage your lands.
Before you hand it over, are there any committee member questions? Representative O'Brien.
A couple. One, when you're talking about warmer winters, is it called striation? What's where seeds have to be frozen for a certain amount of time? Is that becoming an issue too?
That is a great question. I don't know the answer to that, but I am interested in pursuing the answer. I'm sure there are implications with the amount of cold days needed to be able to germinate. Yeah.
The other thing I was thinking of, unfortunately, our rep here who has a big sugaring operation isn't here, but do you recommend sort of ideal sugar bush? You know, it shouldn't be monoculture, I can take it, but even
Yeah.
beyond that, you know, how much of this complexity, can you do a complex forest and have a good sugar bush?
Yes, yes, you can. There's a lot of work being done at the University of Vermont to address this. But it is important if you have a sugar bush, even though sometimes it does come at a cost of, you know, not having a full dominant maple overstory. It's important to have that second generation in case you ever have an event, or if you have, you know, a spongy moth outbreak year after year after year, that can really hammer your forest. And so planning ahead is really important. Yeah.
Representative Lipsky.
Yeah, Al, thank you. It's really a great presentation. You know, there are a couple of things that struck me. When you referred to the Hubbard and Brook Forest, are you talking in New Hampshire or?
Yeah, the Hubbard Brook
Yeah,
experiment.
I've watched that for half a century as an experimental forest. But the other thing you mentioned, which struck me, was planting. And, you know, I always argue that there's so much dormant seed source in this particular forest type, Northern Hardwood forest, that may be the most resilient and complex as far as species, both structured coniferous and deciduous. But one thing I'm observing is that in climate change and for forest complexity travels historically by latitude
Mhm.
and by elevation. Some of us, with Danny hosted when we were over in sort of southern Addison, Rutland County this fall on a forest tour where there was a lot of, for instance, black birch. Let's say it was a maybe 400 or 500 foot elevation forest, and northern red oak that came in and where previously that might not have existed. Whereas up here in higher elevation or northern greens, we're seeing more northern red oak.
Yeah.
Not tin oak. But so I have never in our particular ecosystem, and when you know, you can be out west and it's maybe the 46 or 45 other forest types that are more monospecies, that planting is terribly successful, with the exception of plantations for Norway spruce or some when ag lands being converted or abandoned and then converted to a forest.
Yeah.
So do you really think planting has a big future or positive result?
Yeah, I love that question. So planting, so for those who aren't aware, we really historically have never had to plant. Our forests want to grow. And so it's relatively new. There's a lot of research going into planting. And I think the way that I look at it is we're not planting to displace all of the natural regeneration. It's maybe, you know, sourcing seed for red spruce or red oak that's from a more southern source, again, to just add those traits that might not be there. So kind of treating it as if those plantings might be more of a functional node that contributes to that larger landscape. So we're not trying to plant to displace what's already there. It's just an added value to that system. But there are caveats with that. You know, we're seeing more droughts in the springtime. And so a lot of our plantings have not been a huge success. We've had a lot of mortality. And so I think that's the importance of looking at from a research perspective to see, is this a viable option? Is it worth investing if that is an option that a landowner wants to go about? But I don't think planting is the future. I think it's just one of the many tools that we could potentially use depending on your site and the vulnerabilities of that site.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Thank you, Chairman. Al, do we have enough foresters, timber harvesters, end product developers, sawmills to achieve the goals that
That is a great question. That's probably better answered by.
We'll get into it a little bit in the next
Great, thank you.
presentation. Yeah.
Thank you. Dairy farmer, used to be able to go to 3 different sawmills and get sawdust. And now I think we lost our last one up in Harrisburg. Very sad about that. So I, concerned about, we're laying down a hardwood floor in our house. It'd been nice to have bought local source hardwood for.
Yeah, it's a perfect segue into.
Representative Brown.
Just one more quick follow-up on redundancy. Do our forests have a lot less redundancy now? Because I'm thinking of like chestnut disappearing, butternut disappearing.
Yes, yeah.
And the beech disappears, right? We're sort of
And-
running out of our
and-
mass trees, right?
Yeah, yes. So it's a tricky thing to be able to, implement. But there are some cases where we can try to intervene and kind of have those redundant characteristics, but then there's also times where it's just not possible. With ash leaves out, it's one of the last trees to leaf out, which is really important for spring ephemerals, and there aren't other species that do that. So there are definitely going to be traits that will be lost on the landscape, which is.
Your position is relatively new, Al, the climate
Yeah.
forester. Are you the first to hold?
I'm not, no, there was Ali Kasiba was the climate forester before me.
Okay. Can you just say a little bit about how you, like what your day-to-day work looks like? Do you work with landowners? Are you
Yeah.
out in the field or?
It's a little bit of everything. So within the last year, I've done a lot of work on integrating climate resilience into our state lands planning. So that's been most of my workload. I've also worked with Fish and Wildlife and other partners on developing planting guidelines, including assisted migration, just to have guidance for if and when we do pursue that on state lands. I do a lot of outreach events with landowners. I work closely with Vermont Woodlands Association, who hosts events that landowners come to, as well as BT coverts. And so it's a whole suite of work. I don't know if it's worth adding, I'm a PhD candidate at University of Vermont, so I'm still finishing up my research on the side that contributes directly to my position.
If there aren't any other questions, then you can, you're welcome to stay there at the end of the table. Sometimes people do have questions that they think of later. But why don't we shift over then, Kathy?
Yeah, so record, Catherine Video, I'm the Forest Economy Program Manager with FPR. So I'm just gonna talk a little bit about Vermont's forest economy. I will say Al, as the climate forester, works with a lot of the programs in FPR, so not just with state lands. Al and I collaborate quite a bit. It's not just doing these types of presentations, but also with our grant work. So she's been involved in lots of aspects.
Yeah, we work very closely with Forest Economy.
Yes. So I always like to start conversations about the forest economy by just doing a quick kind of high-level overview of our forest resources here in Vermont. So we're a very heavily forested state, as Al mentioned. We're about 76% forested, so that's about 4.5 million acres. Most of that forest land is what the Forest Service inventory terminology calls timberland, which means that it's capable of producing commercial timber. So that's about 95% of that 4.5 million acres. And of that forest land, most of it is privately owned. So state and local governments own about 10%, the feds own another 10%, the remaining is in private hands. Vermont is in a transition zone as far as forests. So Representative Lipsky, as you mentioned, northern hardwoods is a lot of what covers Vermont. So what we have as our most common forest type is that maple, beech, birch. That's like more than 70% of our forests. As you move into elevations or into Northeast Kingdom, you start to see spruce fir, Connecticut River Valley, you've got some beautiful pine that grows, oak in the Champlain Valley over by Addison. So we've got a diversity, but you can see that shift towards the north as it moves into the Vermont. Our forests are very similar ages. They're growing older and bigger. As a result, they're growing more slowly. So bigger trees grow more slowly. So our total net growth, so that's growth minus mortalities, is slowing down as well, not just because their growth rate is slow, but because our mortality is increasing. And so this is not because of removals or harvesting. This is all just a function of our forests getting older. So we look at a ratio called growth to removals to understand just how much we're taking out of our forests compared to how much we're growing. So if you're at a 1-to-1 growth to removals ratio, then you're sustainable, you're not taking out more than you're growing. Right now, as of this year's data that's being released, we're at 2.9-to-1. So we're growing almost 3 times more wood than we're removing from our forests. So our forest economy, what is it? How big is it? So first, we'll just talk about how big it is. So this is 2017 data. We're in the process of updating this report right now. But the forest product sector in Vermont is the 3rd largest manufacturing sector we have in the state. That's about $1.4 billion in direct output. And when you look at the total output, it's more than $2 billion for our state. So what is it? This is where things start to get a little bit more nuanced and complicated. So forgive the hand-drawn diagram. But so it starts with our landowners. Landowners work with foresters, develop forest management plans. They work to achieve the objectives that they have. All landowners have different objectives and goals. Sometimes they want to see more. My mother likes to see more deer in her yard. Bothers me personally as a forester, but that's fine. Some want birds, some just like the aesthetics. They like to have some privacy around their house. Everyone has a different reason for having their forests with them. And so the foresters work with those landowners, develop management plans so they can achieve those objectives. Our loggers, they're the ones on the ground actually implementing the practices that those foresters are developing. They're the ones that actually make it happen for those landowners on the ground. Next, we've got transportation. So everything that is done in the woods has to go to its next step. So we have loggers who also have trucks. We've got other forms of transportation. They go to our primary processors. So that's sawmills, veneer mills, fuel wood is really where we're talking about primary processes. So for sawmills, in our 2022 survey, we had 39 mills reporting as being in operation. For context, in the early 2000s, that was over 100. So that is a pretty big change.
Where's the permit? Area.
It's a lot, yes. So for fuel wood, just want to explain kind of a little bit about what all is included when we say fuel wood. That includes residential firewood, chips that go for larger systems like that are used in schools, office buildings, hospitals, power stations, and also pellet production. So wood pellets can be used for residential use, but also for those larger commercial institutional settings. This fuel wood piece of the primary processes and primary products has become increasingly important for us here in the region. It provides a market that's very much needed for our lower economically valued, lower quality wood, because we actually no longer have in-state pulp markets. So what we would normally send to a pulp mill for paper, that all now has to go out of state. Transportation costs being what they are, it's important to have additional markets for that. Also, most of you guys all have laptops here, but people just aren't using the paper that they used to.
Can I just pause for a second?
Of course.
Before you transition to this slide, you mentioned the ratio of 2.9-to-1.
Yep.
And then you just mentioned that we don't have a pulp mill left. We've lost many of our sawmills. Is that 2.9 or that 3-to-1 ratio something that's is it growing, first of all, I guess I would ask, and how much of the growth is due to a reduction in demand or a reduction in logging, I would say, because we don't have the local facilities to process wood? And how much of it is the forests are in a natural state where they're just growing beyond what even, we could cope with if we had, more sawmills nearby?
It's a combination of both. Yeah, so that 3-to-1 ratio, that is, it's being driven partially by a reduction in some of the harvest removals that we have. But it's also just that natural slowing as their trees are getting older and we're going through what we call a stem exclusion phase, where you're seeing increased mortality in some of the trees on a site. So it's a factor. And I think you had two questions. What was the?
No, just one,
Okay.
one question really. Yeah, whether this is, I guess the question ultimately is how much is the loss of our processing economy affecting the
A lot.
the larger than a 1-to-1 ratio?
We're starting to see the effects. I think this is something where it's that impact that Al talked about when we were talking about vulnerability. This is one of those impacts or stressors that's kind of on our horizon and could impact how this whole chain flows going forward. And I think you had asked if that 2.9-to-1 was going up. It is. In 2018, it was 2.7. So it's going up, but it's going up more slowly than it had been because of that growth rate. There's a lot of complicated math involved.
So there's a lot going on here in that question and the information that you shared. Thank you. That's helpful. Representative Lipsky.
Kat, I just like to add for context, it's less about markets as much in my opinion has to do with climate and temperature and logging conditions. Timber harvesting, if it's done in an environmentally responsible way, which frankly, there's no other way now, those are the AMPs, those are the expectations of landowners, forest owners. The amount of days that timber harvesting has been able to take place has diminished from to be 180. I were decades when I worked 11 months a year with little or no negative impact. With less frozen winters and wetter summers and falls, that is I think a real factor in reducing our growth to harvest ratio.
The effects on our loggers and in woods production has been a huge issue. Absolutely.
And quite frankly, it's threatening the whole viability of that sector of the economy.
Absolutely. And I have some more to say in a little bit too. Sorry.
Representative O'Brien.
Just to follow up on the chair's question, historically, when was the last time, say it was 1-to-1?
I will have to get back to you on that.
Like George Perkins Marsh era, was it like 1-to-3? Was it totally the other way?
The first inventory that was done by the Forest Service as part of the Forest Inventory Analysis Program was done in 1948. So that's where our data starts. So we can get information from you starting there.
So we have a ratio, we could figure out a ratio from that. Okay, interesting.
So after our primary products, we also have secondary processors. This is where a lot of that value added part comes in. So there's a really large diversity of products that are produced by our secondary manufacturers. A lot of them in Vermont tend to be smaller. We do have some very large, but a lot of them are small shops. So this is flooring, furniture, cabinets, construction, post and beam timbers, panels. They're taking the output from the sawmills and from the veneer mills and putting it into another consumer product. But I think one of the really important things that I always go back to when we're talking about like all the things that are included in the forest economy is that it all starts with landowners. We rely on our working forests. We have to keep our forests as forests. Otherwise, none of this works, right? And so the role of the forest economy in supporting our landowners and our working forests is recognizing that there's opportunity costs involved with land ownership and particularly with forest land ownership. And so having management occur on your forest lands means that landowners, at the very least, are able to avoid some of those costs that are associated with owning land. But oftentimes they're also able to see some revenue generate, some profit to that. And when landowners are able to not have to reduce those costs or to have some income, they're less likely to pursue development or subdivision as a means of generating that income to either maintain their land holdings or even just to justify their land holdings. In the 2018 National Woodland Owner Survey of the Vermont landowners, the number one concern was property taxes. So we know that that cost of ownership is high on our landowners' minds. But in order for us to be able to have those working forests producing that revenue, offsetting those costs, we have to also maintain our market outlets, our supply chain, our workforce, and all the services associated with that. What's not pictured on my slide due to an oversight on my part is our brokers and concentration yards. So they connect us to non-local markets. And just to give a sense of what that looks like, this is our wood flows for the 2022 year. This is just for saw logs. And this is just to demonstrate that Vermont's forest economy doesn't exist in isolation. We interact with our regional, national, and international markets. And so where are we at right now? Our harvested volume is declining, our processing capacity is declining, and we have multiple stressors involved in the system. Climate is impacting our in-woods operations. It's revealed very much a need for a more resilient and adaptive forest supply chain. That's one of the projects that we've been working on with the grant on climate adaptation, both in the woods, but also in the supply chain. We have dealing with shifting consumer preferences. We haven't seen yet really the same energy for local wood products, the type of species that we grow well here, in the same way that there's been a lot of energy for local food and agriculture. We have a lot of market uncertainty because we're not just in Vermont, we're dealing with national and international tariffs, trade, all of that influences our ability to maintain our forest economy the way that we would like it to, our ability to harvest on the landscape, because if you don't know if you're going to be able to ship logs or products to our top trade partners, you're a little bit more hesitant to make those investments. So it can be a real challenge, especially right now where just no one knows what's going to happen. People are sitting on the sidelines waiting to see. For us, Canada and our overseas markets have been really critical for some of our mills just to be able to maintain operations. Another challenge is our interest rates, mortgage rates, impacting residential construction. So just our housing starts are off. We're not building housing that uses a lot of lumber. And so it's just all kind of impacting these challenges. And that impact, it affects our ability to manage our forests, to achieve those landowner goals and objectives, and ultimately has implications for our ability to keep our forests as forests and to ensure that those forests are able to provide the many benefits that we rely on. So it really is the glue that keeps the whole circle going. So looking ahead, what we're doing, where are we going? Good news is that we do have a roadmap now, and we're working on implementing that. Our Forest Future Strategic Roadmap has strategies and actions that touch on all of the pieces that Al and I mentioned today. And then for my program, the Forest Economy Program, we're very small, but we make a pretty big impact. We do as much as we possibly can. We work to obtain and provide grant funding. So we were able to obtain funding to start implementing the roadmap. We provide funding to schools and working lands businesses to either install or upgrade their wood heating systems. We work with partners and we work across programs. And we are also working with some of our other state partners, so like New Hampshire, New York, Maine, throughout the whole region on supporting research and development of markets for innovative products as well. And so then just to kind of bring it all back to that big picture forest economy, I hope that this has provided some insight into the role of Vermont's forest economy in supporting both the state's economy, but also our local communities and our work as a department and as Vermonters to keep our forests as forests for all the benefits they provide.
Thank you.
Happy to take any question.
Representative O'Brien.
Just, have you ever tried to figure out what data, we just heard this morning from rural Vermont, the advocacy group, about how little of our food we grow here, even milk, we import something like what, 50%, is that what we said today? So I'm just wondering, of wood products that we use in the state, how much is coming from in-state?
At a consumer level,
Yeah.
I have not. I'm not sure how we would. I'm sure someone has thought about how we would. It would be interesting.
Yeah.
Yes, Ricky.
Thank you, Jim. Well, a lot of our wood goes past my house,
And then comes back, right?
and then it comes back.
Practice.
I think,
A third of it comes back.
yeah, well, and a lot of it's getting exported, just like our dairy products. You know, whether it's going to different states or going overseas, I mean, one day a week, 100% of the milk made in this country is exported out of country. One day a week. So being in your shoes as being a logger, my shoes as a dairyman, I wish I could export all the cheese out of the caves before the 21st. I think there'll be a lot of log trucks heading north. Hopefully, calmer heads will prevail because we are dependent on this export market. We don't have the sawmills to support our forest production. Our forest production is lower. Some of that's due to your days in the woods. Some of that's due to the labor force out there able to do that work. You know, it's easy compared to driving a tractor to go logging.
Can you,
We can debate that. On camera.
would you mind going back to the slide that shows the two arrows going in and out of the state over the northern border?
Yeah, that was.
Yeah.
Because that's very interesting.
Yeah, could you just walk through those numbers again?
Sure. Yeah, so this is from our 2022 harvest survey. So the saw log harvest, so this is not including roundwood for pulp or just saw logs. So MBF stands for 1,000 board feet. Milla board feet, foresters are unique. So it's almost 89,000 was our harvest here in the state. Processed in Vermont, so that's from the 39 mills that reported operations during that year. This is the volume that they processed, was about 80,000. We imported from other states and a very small amount from Canada, about 33,000.
The 79 is not, it's total, it's not
Correct.
from the 88
Right.
number above it. It's some of it was harvested in Vermont, some not. Yeah.
And then we export a significant amount of our sawlog harvests. And this often has to do with just like species that we have here versus species that other states have or other areas have, what our mills are looking to saw for various consumer preferences or products.
And then the map on the left.
Yep, so that one is just really showing the northern flow. So usually the flow back into Vermont is at 0. This was a unique year in 2022, where we actually imported a very small amount from Canada.
We built a big barn,
Oh.
999 feet long.
Everything looks good.
You know, a lot of that flow, it's going north on the higher quality wood that's being processed globally is due to the fact that the Port of Montreal for the East Coast is probably the largest port for wood products. Maybe the Port of Baltimore might be a second one, or down in Savannah for Jacksonville on the southeastern shore. But, so that's a factor for
It is.
where that's going. There's also, and I can speak from probably half a century of shipping logs north over the border because the provincial government in Canada, as well as the Canadian federal government, values business, industry and employment, subsidizes many businesses, including the forest products business. Whereas dairy historically or farming has gotten a lot of subsidies. The forest sector has almost never had them. There's some attempts now, but that's a factor why you're seeing
So go.
way more exported than.
Yeah. There's also just some structural differences in Canada's forest products industry compared to ours. So Canada has a lot more nationally held forest land, and so they're able to provide it. Like they have cut rates off of crown lands. They're not quite as reliant on the private landowners the way that we are here. So that can be a huge influence. The energy costs in Canada are staggeringly low compared to ours. Like
Insurance costs.
insurance. So just your overhead cost for running a facility in Canada is just very different than what we see here. And that means that their ability to purchase logs, to move logs further distances than what we can do, it just influences all of that ability for trade.
Yeah, we subsidize their electricity up there, by the way. Have you ever worked with, the Rough Grouse Society in Coverts?
Yeah.
Yes.
And there's a gentleman from the Rough Grass Society who is part of our roadmap implementation steering committee. Yes.
I like a diverse forest. I used to really chase grouse and deer a lot more than I do now. I'm not so mad at them anymore. And, you know, that diverse forest holds those animals.
Just if we step back to not the process, but the pellets, chips and firewood, those would be interesting, given that there's this big debate over biomass fuels. And I would think that most chips, say for Rygate or McNeil, probably come from Vermont. I don't know, but
Also coming from our neighboring states, right? So you're looking at radius distances.
yep.
So there, at a certain point, it just doesn't make sense to ship something that far.
Right.
But both McNeil and Rygate are located on borders, and so they're going to reach into those other states to some extent.
Sure, yeah.
But the other thing to keep in mind is that those chips, some of those are going to be sawmill residues, so what's left over. And some of those logs that those mills in another state are processing came from Vermont. Right, so it's really hard to put a hard line on those state boundaries. So I always say, like, this is a regional economy. We can't hyper focus on Vermont and forget that we all play in the same sandbox.
We must be a net exporter, I would say, of firewood, just from what we've heard in here, I would think.
Well, it depends on what type of firewood.
But pellets, right? We're importing a lot of pellets for what we potentially could do.
We have
We have very little.
One.
Yeah, one.
we're down to 1.5.
For pellet manufacturing in the state, we have very limited
Is
capacity.
that a growth area?
Potential.
Especially as people are putting in more modern wood heating, advanced wood heating systems where you're looking at chips and pellets. Particularly for residential use, pellets are a really attractive choice. So, yeah. Pros and cons to everything.
Representative Liskey, did you have?
Yeah, this still is a question for Al. And I can't tell you how excited I am and respectful of Vermont FBR for having a climate forester. I've worked with, you know, a couple of capacities with the first Ali Kasiba, Dr. Kasiba. Excited you're going to be a doctor soon. But that aside, I'm what my question has to do with. And I can tell you that loggers are respectful and acutely aware of all of the climate pressures, the need for biodiversity, the need for these complex versus simple forests. And we've been bought in. And now, as we deal with like songbird habitat and nesting at certain levels and a canopy of mid-level, wildlife and outdoor recreation, soils, water quality, all those critical values that are highly valued in the broad Vermonter population. Yet, what it takes to be profitable when we're asked to acquire, maintain, and pay for complex, low ground pressure, Scandinavian design that relabeled here or whatever, that are, as high as 700,000-800,000 per piece, to be respectful. How do we, no one's going back to high grading. That had its period in history around the world. It's still going on around the world, but in Vermont, that's history. How do we implement some of these initiatives that you so articulately highlighted, and still be able to make a living and stay in business? That, as you move forward in your advocacy and your work, that has to be one of the overlays and
Absolutely.
balances that needs to be considered.
Yeah. One of the things that Al and I work together a lot on is all fantastic management plans, ideas, and then I come along and say, but how are we gonna
How do we
pay
pay
for
for
this?
it? Yeah.
How are we gonna get people to do this? How does this actually work? And then we are able to work on like our LSR climate grant, where we're looking at what are the costs associated with these things? How do we do this?
Commissioner
Just
Fitzgerald.
touch on the grant we just got that has a contract writer to pay for some of these
Yes,
as a
absolutely.
pilot. We're trying to pilot this.
So we do have an Infrastructure Reduction Act, or no, not introduction.
I
I don't know what RAA stands for now. It's not, it can't be infrastructure reduction.
Inflation.
There we go. It's like that. It doesn't
We
make
want
sense.
expanded infrastructure.
Inflation Reduction Act. There we go. Yes. Yeah, so we just got a very large grant, $5 million. And part of that is doing underserved landowner outreach, but also doing contract writers for foresters to put climate adaptive practices into management plans. And it's another contract stipend writer working with loggers to implement those practices on the ground. So as a pilot, to see how we can get this going and to build capacity within our supply chain, within our workforce, so that our loggers and our foresters have that skill set, have that knowledge base, and can also market themselves to landowners as having experience and knowledge and skills in climate adaptive practices.
There are other grants that are similar to that, not as robust, but I do know, I think is it North New England Forestry Foundation also has funding to pay loggers to be able to do those practices that would cost them money to do. So there are funding sources out there, but it is a huge problem, and I'm glad you articulated that.
Yeah, we'll take one more question. We're about at time. Representative Nelson.
How is the price of timber up on the hill? How has that changed in the last 25 years? I saw an ad last year for pine at $320 a thousand. And I said, good Lord, they were paying $320 a thousand back in 2010.
Yep.
How can that be viable to the landowner, to the logger, to the trucker? I mean, and we know what a cost of a 2x4 is downtown now. It's the same, it's like milk, it's just not right.
Yes.
It's not a sustainable.
It really isn't. Is there? Was there some way that value could be added to what you're trying to achieve, Al? Is there something that we can do that would add value to that type of management? I mean, I see pictures on social media, they get done, they're in there, they pull the culverts, they put in the water bars, they're seeding down the roads, they're seeding down the log landings. They look beautiful. It costs money to do all this. I mean, somewhere, somebody's gotta have a nickel, the landowner needs to have money to hold the wood, pay the taxes. The logger needs to have money to buy the equipment, pay their people, and have a life. The sawmill needs to make some money. Where is that disparity? Is it the brokers that are brokering it between the sawmill and the end point?
I don't know that I could answer exactly where, like, point to which part of that is broken. We know that it is, at wholesale, like, we're paying it's the same prices that they were in early 2000s, absolutely. Like, it's just, it hasn't changed. But from a sawmill perspective, they're paying more for logs, which makes it hard. Like, the price of logs sometimes for them are going up because there's less of it coming out of the wood. So now they're competing for a smaller amount. And so they have to pay more for it, but they're not getting more on the other side. And so there's contraction on both sides. And I think there are lots of ideas around how we could do some value adding, through marketing of our sustainable forestry and our local products, through certification. Like, there's lots of ideas out there. It's a matter of exploring.
I just bought hardwood cherry thorn, real hardwood cherry thorn for our house. Coming out of Maine. Some of the logs may have come from Vermont. I hope they did. This is coming from a sawmill in Maine. Maine Wood Products. $6.80 square foot, 5-inch. I'm excited. The laminate, the engineered stuff with a skim of hardwood on it, and they said, well, it's real wood. You can sand it and refinish it. Yeah, about that. Is $8-9 a square foot. I would have paid $8-9, $10 a square foot if I could have sourced it in Vermont from one of these deals. I think things to work on.
Absolutely. And it's in the roadmap. It's one of those strategies of how do we start to look at this? What are our opportunities?
Because we know that a regenerating forest sequesters much more carbon than those big, beautiful trees that are in Greg Burt's woods that he's tapping. Which is great. I love maple syrup, too, you can see.
The big trees store a lot of carbon. The smaller trees pull in more.
Pull-
So you
pull-
will.
And you take that big tree and you turn it into saw logs and you build it into a stick-built house and you forever, hopefully forever, for many, many centuries, store that carbon.
Somebody made a lot of money during COVID with lumber.
It wasn't the logger, because our price
Oh, you know that,
went up 500%.
No.
Consumer.
We built a 999-foot barn during COVID. Trust me, I know somebody made a lot of money.
We should stop here now, I think, and we may be asking you back, Catherine, for a couple of things, including a presentation on the forest future roadmap.
Friday for next week.
Okay, good, excellent.
So, yeah, any questions?
So a lot more opportunity to have these conversations than next week when you're in, when we're talking about the roadmap. Yes, good. All right.
Really appreciate it.
Tony, we're all set.
Oh, yeah, self-sharing.
Good luck, future dog.
We're gonna take,
So excited.
we're gonna take